Do you think that recent developments in AI will make some jobs obsolete in the next 5 to 10 years? And what would that mean for us as workers, consumers, and citizens?
Yeah, so I'll bring a historical perspective to this, first of all, because I think it's helpful to think about how when something like machines become much more ubiquitous in the workforce, thinking here particularly of Industrial Revolution. We know that there were a lot of folks who were quite concerned about machine forms of labor, factory forms of labor, and there had a number of reasons. I know we refer to these people as Luddites, and I should say I'm not a Luddite in some senses, because the famous image of the Luddite is someone who just goes and bashes technology because they're just afraid of technology or they don't like machines. And I think that's sort of a superficial reading of what they were about. I think what's really valuable to understand about what that period was about is people were convinced that industrial forms of work were going to not just take guilds out of production or, cause people who had been living in villages to move to these big urban cities. That was not, that was a concern, but the main issue was that it was going to reduce human beings to machines. And so for them, the question that was of paramount significance is the loss of humanity. And so thinking here about what does work and humanity have to do with each other, I think that's a really important question. So, for instance, if you're involved in the making of things, building things, if you're in construction or if you're an artisan or what have you, one of the things that's so important for you to do as you learn the skill is you develop yourself while you develop the skill. So it's not just that you can do certain functions, right? Assemble a table or something like that, but that you invest yourself in the making of the table in this very historical, time-bound manner in which you struggle with yourself to develop skills. And so there's a dimension of interiority that is constantly happening as you deal with your frustration, as you deal with your delight, as you're learning certain kinds of skills. And there's this sense that the work that you do can never simply be replicated. There's an external replication, right? I made a kitchen table. Somebody else could make one very close to the one I made, but it still wouldn't be exactly my table because there's this element of my having invested myself, and that includes my skill sets, my emotional life, all these sorts of features. And I think what people need to appreciate is that that's actually a very important part of how you develop as a human being, right? You learn what you love, you learn what you're not so good at, you learn how to deal with your frustration, how to deal with your impatience. And so the work that you do is never simply a copy of what a machine would do, right? It's a fundamentally different kind of endeavor. And again, I'm not saying machines can't do incredibly good work, precise work even, but it's a question about what happens to people when workers think they can be reduced to a machine in the production of things.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really deep thought there. I think in prep for this, I was actually looking over some of my old things that I'd written down a few years ago and trying to figure out what my stance was and how it's changed. And I came across this goofy Quora thing I wrote in 2017 when someone asked me to, sort of predict what will happen with AI and the workforce. And, surprisingly enough, my thoughts have not changed very much, which is that I think AI will replace a ton of people. It will disrupt entire industries, and it will not be anywhere nearly as isolated as people think. And I remember back in 2017 when I wrote it, I got a lot of pushback because people thought I was dystopian and way too pessimistic. And I thought, it's not just going to be the mechanical, it's not going to be the jobs that people think are easy to replace. I think it will be much higher up the stack, and really there will be very few industries, if any, that will be left untouched. And I think that's sort of happening. I think it's just happened faster than I expected. I thought that even in the back of my head that some of the creative industries would be not necessarily spared, but they would take a while to be attacked as they are or disrupted as they are now. But that part has been coming much faster than I expected. And surprisingly, the robots' inability to do simple mechanical tasks have actually let them out of the things that people really thought were going to be easily automatable. And so it's the creative industries that have actually been attacked much faster. So that's been the surprise. But yeah, I struggle to think of things that cannot be replaced. And I think even today, when I read articles, I think people really underestimate the ability of AI to replace many of us. And what happens after that is really a big open question.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Because this is really interesting to me. Is what's being replaced a set of functions? Or is what's being replaced actually something like humans? Because I know you can talk about humans, reduce them to a set of functions, and I have no doubt that we've already got machines that can calculate, that can, keep memory. I mean, way faster than I can do. But is that a good way to describe what it is to be human, a set of functions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm just being what I'm doing right now and sort of the work that I'm doing right now. I think I'm so immersed in just the physical, the logistical, the in-your-face realism aspects of it, right? So not so much the identity. I think there's some of that. And when I talk to artists who have sort of felt this sense of loss and replacement by AI models, a lot of it does come from the sense of like, this is who I am, and how dare you take my own work and effectively replace me with it, right? That sense of loss and betrayal is really fundamental. But there's also this very visceral sort of sense of there are tons of people who are literally being displaced. They have no jobs. Their income has been completely taken away and disrupted. And in that sense, that sense of just, your position is no longer open, I think that's something that will really hit, I would guess, the majority of us within some fixed time span. And that's the sort of the physical reality that I'm mostly thinking about.
So how do we, a lot of people in this room are graduating soon from college or maybe from grad school. How do we think, speaking for myself, how do we think about this potential for AI technology replacing parts of the functions of our job, or maybe our job in its entirety? How do we plan for that? What's the best mental framework to approach this with?
So I think this is a marvelous opportunity for us to ask the question, what's a human life for? Because if we think a human life is for the execution of a whole bunch of functions, maybe that's the mistake, because I think it's very clear that machines are going to vastly exceed the ability to perform functions. All sorts of functions that human beings can perform right now. Not as well, not as quickly, whatever. So what does it mean then to ask the question, what's a human life for? I think that's a question that's very, very important to have on the table, because there have been philosophical traditions that talk about work as a way towards self-realization. And I don't think they're talking just about the functions that you perform in the work. And it raises a set of questions about some of what we might call the interior life of a human being, right? And how perhaps what we should be worried about is not just that machines are going to take over jobs, but machines are going to take away the opportunity for us to develop our interior lives. Because if you just sit around, you don't have any friction, you don't have any serious engagement with the world that allows you to come to terms with your own ignorance or your own impatience or your own whatever. And I think that's a really important part of growing into a human being, is engaging things, engaging communities, engaging other people. And if we just reduce that to, or just hand that over to machines, I think the ability for us to develop as people is going to be also severely diminished.
So just to follow up, so if AI can perform functions that we also do as workers but no longer need to do, are you saying that perhaps an approach is to consider what functions we're handing off to machines and think about what impact that has on us as humans and how we grow? Or what's...
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. I think, there's also a question about how do you make a life? And right now, you get paid for doing functions. And if the functions are going to be done by machines, does that mean you don't get paid anymore? Right? So I think this raises some really important questions about if what matters about you is the functions you perform and machines can do them and machines do it more cheaply, then you're really out of luck. And the question then is, well, what again is livelihood for you? If you're not making money, right? Do we have to start thinking differently about how we secure a human livelihood if it's not because you're performing functions? Is there something else that would be on the table? I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Norman and I think are similar perspectives, but at different sort of levels of abstraction about some of these issues, and it's really fascinating. When I think about these issues and the challenges, I think about sort of the visceral, the pragmatist in me sees sort of the immediate dangers and challenges, and so for me, it's a question of, when people get displaced, what happens, right? And the standard answer is always, well, humans will endure, and human creativity, industries will be hurt, but will bounce back, and you have training and redirection of labor force and so on. And I just don't think that fully describes the kind of things that are going to happen in AI and when AI hits some of these industries, because I think there's no protection, there's no awareness of what an post-AI world would look like. We're not ready. When I read about legislators and regulators and lawmakers and how they think about the economy and how they think about the labor force, universal basic income is not something that is well considered. It is not something that people think of as a necessity or even a reasonable policy. And so, but yet we're going to hit this situation very soon, I think, in a number of years where a really big chunk of the workforce will be displaced, and there will be insufficient training. There will just not be insufficient training. And the idea that we're going to somehow magically train 40, 50-year-old artists who've been in the industry 20 plus years to all of a sudden become program, software engineers or whatever else is a little bit further away from being replaced by AI is, I think, a fantasy. And so there is a real pragmatic question of what happens to people and what do we do as a society as millions are displaced. And it will not be like anything else that has come before. I really don't believe that the analogies to the printing press, to the digital photography, to all the things that have come before are adequate to compare for what's coming. And so I think these are really reasonable questions that really need to be raised. And I think some of the lawmakers in the EU and a little bit in the US are slowly hearing some of this. But man, I just don't know if they're going to move fast enough. And the consequences, could be dire.
I think you've just raised an incredibly important point, which is the question of political economy, right? Who's it benefiting to have this rapid development? And I think you cannot talk about this without talking about capitalist markets, which are constantly driven by the desire to expand, right? Expansion has to continue. And that means when you're thinking in sort of quantity measures of functions, you always have to do more faster. And of course, in that race, human beings are just going to be obsolete because we're not efficient, right? And so the question then is, what sort of a political economy needs to be in the minds of people who are thinking through these questions so that we can ask the questions about how do we shift a political economy where we center human beings, their interior lives, right? The things that could make them genuinely happy, rather than simply being caught up, subsumed by, overrun by these technologies that are increasing market share for investors, right? Silicon Valley, right?
I don't know if either of you saw I think you did, the open letter that went around maybe a week or two ago from a lot of the bigger names in this AI space asking for like a 6-month moratorium on the development of large language models, saying this stuff is moving too fast, we need to stop. And a lot of people signed on, a lot of people that I personally was surprised by, given their previous involvement in kind of pushing this technology. But it indicates that people are thinking about this. So do you think that strain of thought will will blossom, or do you think the economic incentives, to your point, Norman, are too strong, and Ben, the technical incentives?
I don't know that enough people are aware of what's actually coming, right? So what you're describing, I think a lot of people, they just don't think this is going to happen. They're pretty happy with Alexa. I mean, seriously, I mean, you can get up in the morning and, Alexa can book your vacation for you. I mean, that's pretty wonderful. And I think on the one hand, there are so many people who are attracted to this because they think it elevates them into a godlike position where they have maximal control over the world, and yet they don't realize how the technology is actually playing them and will actually dissolve their future.
So right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, in Silicon Valley for many years, it took a long time for people to realize that if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. And, now people realize it. They're slowly realizing it. But even today, like the people who are using AI art models, generative art models, for example, there's this prevailing argument that this unlocks my creativity, right? Never mind the fact that this is built upon decades of existing artwork taken without compensation or authorization from real artists who worked decades to get this their artwork, and now you're sort of replicating them. But this is unlocking my creativity. But they're not. They're just cogs in a machine. And to that letter that Emily was referring to, boy, there's so many issues with that letter. It's irony in so many ways. Sponsored by the Future of Humanity Institute and signed by many of the folks who basically got us here. Right? It's always irks me to see the people sign it and who are like, "Oh yes, this is horrible." Wait, you're the company that got us here, so
and are making a lot of money,
and yet you're still continuing to do it. And of course, the irony being that Elon Musk funded a bunch of these companies. He signed the letter, and then what has it been, like 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, he just announced that Twitter, now X Corp, is going to build a competitor to ChatGPT. Like, so you wanted the other company to have a moratorium so that you can build your own competitive version. It's just got all sorts of issues with it. And so, yeah, I think it was nice to have some awareness, have some discussion because of that letter, but boy, is it not, giving the right vibes, I think, as to its real purpose.